All right, let's jump straight into this explainer. I want you to picture this. $9 compared to $61. Back in the 1930s Jim Crow South, state education departments were typically spending a meager $9 a year to educate a black student. Meanwhile, they were allocating $61 for a white student. That is nearly a seven-fold difference in basic human investment. Today, we're going to explore exactly how that raw, mathematical disparity shaped our economy for generations to come. Welcome to the statistical story of inequality. Today, we're doing a data-driven deconstruction of the early 20th century American labor market to uncover how separate and fundamentally unequal systems forged our economic realities.
So, to really wrap our heads around the historic wage gap, we have to ask a pretty tough question. Was historical inequality primarily driven by blatant wage discrimination from racist employers, or was it about massive systemic deficits built up around those workers? Basically, were bosses just paying black workers less for the exact same skills, or was the divide driven by systemic gaps in early opportunities? You know, like that $9 versus $61 school funding gap. Well, the answer is incredibly revealing.
Section 1, 1901, the macro baseline.
Let's set the stage. Looking back at the economic and demographic indicators from 1901, we see a remarkably young nation. The median age in the U.S. was just 22.9 years old. And the formal economy? It was heavily male-dominated. We're talking an 80% labor force participation rate for men compared to just over 20% for women. What's absolutely wild about this snapshot is how the average American family's budget was geared almost entirely toward sheer survival. A massive 42.5% went strictly to food. You add in housing at about 23%, clothing at 14%, and you quickly realize that nearly 80% of a family's income went toward just keeping a roof over their heads and food on the table. There was virtually no safety net and honestly very little disposable income.
Meaning, average folks were living right on the razor's edge. I mean, they were literally outspending their income. They were bringing in $750 a year, but spending $769. Keep in mind, this was a time when round steak was just 14 cents a pound, yet families were still going into the red just to survive the year.
Moving to Section 2, the micro-realities, women in the workplace.
Now, while the male industrial experience was incredibly gritty and dangerous, it did actually offer mobility. It offered supervisory power and a ladder to climb. But for women, the historical analysis shows employment functioned way more as a caste than a class. They were constantly subjected to petty discipline without any real avenues for promotion, and all the while society was actively pushing them to find their true identity and authority in domestic life, rather than on the factory floor.
Section 3, the Jim Crow wage gap.
46.7. That number is just staggering. It represents the massive age and location-adjusted wage gap between black and white male workers in the 1940s South. To understand a chasm that wide, we have to look at the very real power structures enforcing it. Remember, this was the era following the peak of the second Ku Klux Klan, which surged between 1915 and 1944. The Klan wasn't just some fringe group. They functioned as a systemic enforcer of white supremacy. They utilized outright racial terror to suppress black economic mobility and guarantee a cheap, compliant labor force. But how exactly did that campaign of terror translate into a 46.7-point wage gap on paper?
Well, to break down that gap, researchers use a concept called human capital. It's basically the actual educational foundation, the skill set, and the quality of schooling that workers brought to the job market. And back in 1940, researchers didn't just count up how many years of school someone finished, they looked really closely at the actual quality of the local schools those students were permitted to attend.
Which brings us to Section 4, the human capital deficit.
Just look at this contrast. You've got a typical 156-day school year for white Southern students, matched up against a drastically shortened 123-day term for black students. And look, this was no accident. By utilizing violence and intimidation to systematically disenfranchise black voters, white supremacist power structures ensured that black communities had literally zero political leverage to demand equal school funding or longer terms. It left black students with 20% less classroom time each and every year before they even had a chance to enter the workforce.
Here's the kicker. Economists estimate that if the Supreme Court's infamous separate but equal doctrine had actually been enforced as equal, if school funding had simply been matched dollar for dollar, it would have wiped out roughly half of the wage inequality for that entire generation. Up to 51% of the wage gap was entirely due to this manufactured, mathematically enforced deficit in basic education.
Finally,
Section 5. The New Deal intervenes.
$365. By 1929, that was the average per capita income in the American Southeast, the absolute lowest in the entire nation. Southern farmers were making a mere fraction of what West Coast farmers made, and Southern industrial workers were severely underpaid compared to their counterparts up north. The entire region was fundamentally trapped in an extractive, low-wage economy.
To break this brutal cycle, the federal government stepped in with a sequence of New Deal policies. First, the National Recovery Administration started actively encouraging higher wages and better working conditions. Then, the monumental 1938 Fair Labor Standards Act was passed, which eventually culminated in a mandatory 25-cent national minimum wage. It eventually rose to 40 cents, but that initial floor was a game changer.
As the historical analysis points out, this minimum wage disproportionately lifted low-paid Southern workers, bringing Southern wages within reach of Northern ones. This systemic federal intervention acted as a vital bridge, you see. It artificially pushed the purposefully suppressed wages of the Jim Crow South up toward national standards, essentially overriding the local systems that had kept labor so cheap for so long.
So we're left with this really provocative question. If equalizing basic education in 1940 could have erased half the wage gap for that generation, how much of today's economic inequality is simply the inherited math of historical deficits? When analysts look at modern wealth divides, or when historians trace the structural echoes of the Second Klan's ideologies to modern events like the 2017 Unite the Right rally, the data demands we ask ourselves, are we just looking at the compound interest of a system that was built to be separate and fundamentally unequal? It's a lot to think about. Thanks for exploring this with me, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.